one of the intense pleasures of travel is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel the past in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in the Amazon, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology, and that is the idea that the world into which you were born doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, a consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your cultural lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma, an eagle hunter in Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof shaman in Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of being, other ways of orienting yourself in social, spiritual, ecological space. And that's an idea that can only fill you with hope. Now, together, the myriad cultures of the world make up a social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the biological web of life that you know so well as the biosphere. And in an early book, I coined the term ethnosphere for this cultural web of life, and I defined the ethnosphere as being the sum total of all thoughts and dreams and ideas and myths and intuitions brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is a great human legacy. And just as a biological web of life is being severely eroded with the loss of plant and animal species, so too is the ethnosphere, but if anything at a far greater rate. No biologist, for example, would dare suggest that 50% of all plants and animals are moribund, and yet that, the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When each of you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, language isn't just grammar and vocabulary, it's a flash to the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of a culture comes to the material world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages, by absolute academic consensus, half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants. And what this means is that we're living through a time where, by definition, half of humanity's ecological, social, spiritual knowledge is at risk. This doesn't have to happen. Now, the reason it's so poignant is that it's also happening in the very decade in which geneticists have finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true. And that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean studies of the human genome have left no doubt that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is a fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all descendants of the same handful of people who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago. But the important point is that if we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, we all, by definition, share the same raw genius. And how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of cultural orientation and priorities. There is no hierarchy in the realm of culture. That old Victorian idea that we somehow went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized with the Strand of London has been absolutely ridiculed by modern science and has been shown to be as irrelevant to our lives today as the notion that clergymen had in Victorian Europe, that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And so in this stunning affirmation of the human spirit, genetics has come together to affirm the central revelation of anthropology. And what that means fundamentally is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 different voices of humanity. And those answers collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us all in the coming decades, and indeed the centuries. Every culture has something to say, Each deserves to be heard, just as none has monopoly on the route to the divine. The question is, what do you do about it? If you're a biologist and you identify an area of high species endemism, you seek to create a protected area, but you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't freeze people in time. Change is the one constant in the affairs of culture. So many years ago, when I was recruited to the National Geographic with the mission to try to change the way the world viewed and valued culture in a decade, I concluded that politicians follow but never lead, polemics are not persuasive, but storytellers change the world. So I set out over a 15-year period to take our global audience to points in the ethnosphere where the beliefs and practices were so dazzling that you couldn't help but come away with a new appreciation of culture. So I sailed on Hokulea with my good friend Nainoa Thompson, Polynesian wayfinders who can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon just by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern that can be read with the same specificity with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. These are sailors who, in the darkness of the hull of the vessel, can distinguish as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the sacred canoe, distinguishing those caused by local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. Now, if we slip into the greatest forest on earth, the Amazon, we enter the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimokos, people who believe that their descendants came up the Milk River in the east in the belly of the sacred serpent. People who live so closely to the forest that cognitively they do not distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the heavens is equated to the canopy of the rainforest. We now understand that the social structures that envelop the lives of these people are there to facilitate not conflict, but peace, trade, communication, not the least of which is a marriage rule that says you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken. You never hear a child practicing a distinct tongue. Even more profoundly, we've come to understand that their mythologies amount to nothing more or less than a highly specific land management plan that dictates precisely how people in great numbers could live in the upland forests of the Amazon. Now, excuse me, if we move from the forest into the mountains, let's embrace for a moment the notion of sacred geography. Now, what do I mean by that? You and I were raised in Canada to believe that a mountain was a pile of rock ready to be mined. That makes us profoundly different than my godchildren in the mountains of Peru who believe that a mountain is a deity, an Apu spirit that will direct his or her destiny. The issue isn't who's right and who's wrong. What you have to pay attention to is how the belief system mediates the relationship between the human society with profoundly different consequences for the ecological footprint of that society. In the Andes, reciprocity, exchange, works on economic, on cultural, and on spiritual levels, and it's reaffirmed always in ritual. My godson, blessed to become the Wailaka, a transvestite figure, given the clothing of his mother to carry the ritual banners to lead all able-bodied men on a run, but it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,000 feet, run down to 8,000 feet, and then you run to 17,000 feet, only to fall away into the sacred valley. And the whole idea is that the men go into the mountains as individuals, but through exhaustion and sacrifice means to make sacred, they emerge as a single entity that has reaffirmed their sense of belonging in the landscape. And if we move into the southern Andes, the great festival of Coiriti, where tens of thousands of indigenous people converge on a sacred valley, bringing the crosses of their churches in the shadow of Ausangati, the most sacred mountain of the Inca, to reaffirm the power of the earth infused into their lives. Or if we move into the homeland of the elder brother, the Kogi, the Wiwa, the Cancuano, and the Arawakos in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia, in a blood-stained continent, the only people never vanquished by the Spanish, and to this day they're ruled by a ritual priesthood. But the training for the priesthood is rather astonishing. The young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which they're enculturated in the values of their society, which include the proposition that their prayers and rituals literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And then, as young men, having never seen a sunrise, never seen the horizon, they're led out of the sacred temple and taken on a journey to the center of the world. Everything they've learned in the abstract is affirmed in studying glory. And the priest who has trained them essentially says, you see, it's as I've promised you all these years, it's yours to protect. They call themselves the elder brothers, and they dismiss the rest of us who have squandered our inheritance on this earth as the younger brothers. Slip for a moment into the deserts of Australia. When the British arrived in Australia, they met people that looked strange, had a simple technology, but what really offended the British is the Aboriginal people had no interest in improving their material lot. And of course, progress was the ethos of the colonial world at that time. So in their inimitable way, the British concluded that the Aboriginal people weren't people at all, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human or not. And what was really going on was a subtle devotional philosophy beyond the reach of the British imagination. That was a dreaming. And the dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a conviction that the world both exists and is eternally waiting to be born. The entire ethos in Australia wasn't change and progress, it was stasis and constancy. The only purpose in life was to do the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to keep the earth just as it was at the time of its creation. It's as if all of Western thought had gone into pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it exactly as it was when Adam and Eve had that fateful conversation. Now, the issue, again, isn't who's right and who's wrong. Had we followed that trajectory, yes, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon, but on the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the life support systems of the planet. Now, we have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful, are destined to fade away. Nothing could be further from the truth. Change and technology is no threat to culture. Power is a threat to culture. In every case, these are dynamic, living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation, because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. If we move for a moment into the forests of the Penan, the last great nomadic peoples of Southeast Asia, within a single generation, the forests have been torn down, the rivers have become laden with silt, and a way of life morally inspired has been crushed along the forest that gave it birth. These are nomadic peoples. Nomads are different. How do you measure wealth in a society where there's no incentive to accumulate anything? In Penan culture, wealth is explicitly defined as a strength of social relations between people. What about sharing? There is no word for thank you in the Penan language because sharing is an automatic reflex. I once gave a cigarette to an old Penan woman and watched as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut in the encampment, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. If the industrial intrusions are one threat to culture, perhaps a more pernicious one is ideology, be it the ubiquitous cult of modernity or the Marxist mania of Beijing. I spent a lot of time with Tibet. I just came back from Tibet. And the Dalai Lama, when he first spoke with Mao Zedong, who incidentally was responsible for the murder of more of his own people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together, when he famously said to His Holiness that all religion is poison, the Dalai Lama knew what was coming. And when the jackboot of the Red Guard finally vanquished Lhasa in 1959, 1.2 million Tibetans were killed for their religious faith. 6,000 temples were torn apart. And what was it about the Dharma that so threatened the Marxist materialists? All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that all life was negative. He just meant shit happens. The second of the Noble Truths was that the cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency and the cruelty of human delusion as we cling to the idea that we are central in the stream of divine existence. A third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome. And of course, the fourth and most consequential was the delineation of a contemplative practice that, if pursued, not only had a possibility of a transformation of the human heart, but had 2,500 years of empirical evidence that that transformation would happen. I embarked on a project that we called the Buddhist Science of the Mind with my friend Jarrett Martineau, who, as part of his 7 years of medical training, spent 1 year in this cave in meditative retreat. With us also was my good friend Mathieu Ricard, the Buddhist scholar and photographer. And we went to find this woman who had 45 years before gone into lifelong retreat. This photograph was taken in the instant that sunlight fell upon her face for the first time in 45 years. By the terms of reference of our culture, she should have been mad. But the face that greeted us radiated compassion and serenity. And the Lama who was with me said, this is the proof of the efficacy of the science of the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism, the serenity achieved by the practitioner. And later a Lama said to me, you know, we in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do. And so the Tibetans leave it to us as they chart their future with the breath of the Diamond Sutra. They ask of us why it is that we continue to tolerate the wrath of China as it crushes the civilization that has given so much to the world. When the British first reached the Arctic, they took the Inuit to be savages. The Inuit took the British to be gods. Both were wrong. What the British failed to understand is there's no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in a harsh environment where everything had to be forged from the cold. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. The great thing about an Inuk sled is you could always eat it if you ran out of food because the struts were made of meat. The runners were made of fish wrapped in a robe. And now, even on the eve of a cultural renaissance, unlike anything that's ever been seen, they are now suffering from something, of course, beyond their capacity to adapt to, and that is climate change. So in the end, you have to ask yourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? It's not about the traditional versus the modern. It's about the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. It's not about freezing peoples in time like some kind of zoological specimen. It's recognizing that every culture deserves a seat at the Council of Human Wisdom. The goal isn't to keep anyone from the genius of modernity, but to find ways that everybody can benefit from those sparks of light of the human imagination, but critically, without that engagement, demanding the death of who they are as a people. And the answer and the reason for that is not nostalgia, it's not romance, it's about geopolitical survival. Culture is not trivial, it's not decorative. Culture is, in every society, a body of moral and ethical values that we wrap around each individual to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies within all of us. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, find order and meaning in the universe, to do what Lincoln said, always seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost and the constraints of tradition are torn asunder, you only have to look at the points of agony around the world. Because in the end, we need the prayers of these Tibetan monks, like we need the hopes of the Maasai warriors, like we need the promise of the Inuk kids in the north, because for all of us and for all time, those prayers, those songs, those words are part of our collective geography of hope. Thank you very much.